Welcome, everybody, to our webinar today. My name is Chloe. I'm the Partner Marketing Manager here at Field Effect. Today, we're going to be speaking about the new CMMC rules. The wait is over, the rules are out, and we have an expert here today to walk us through what that looks like and what it means for your business. So, introducing today's expert, he is Matt Lewis, our Chief Security Officer here at Field Effect. Matt has over 20 years in cybersecurity, extensive background in IT strategy, security ops, data analysis, incident response, and probably missing even a few bullets from there too. So really in-depth experience in cybersecurity. And what he's actually responsible for here at Field Effect is oversight into our physical and information security and technical compliance programs. So who better to speak to this today than Matt? And we look forward to it. So take it away.
Yeah, thanks very much, Chloe. We have a jam-packed session today. This is the first time I've given this presentation, and the real challenge for me was trying to take the immense amount of information about CMMC that's out there and slim it down into a cohesive narrative that doesn't get lost in the weeds, but it still provides value to people at numerous knowledge levels. So hopefully I hit the mark. We'll see about that in just a little bit. First, we're going to do an introduction to explain what CMMC is and why it's important. Then we're going to get familiar with popular CMMC vernacular and go through some of the big changes and structure that were articulated in the final rule. After that, we're going to dive into how to be prepared for a CMMC audit. And finally, we'll talk about how CMMC and Field Effect are here to support defense companies and our channel partners supporting defense companies. So without further ado, let's get to it. An introduction to CMMC. So this is right from the DoD, the Department of Defense website. Cybersecurity is a top priority for the Defense Department. The defense industrial base faces increasingly frequent and complex cyber attacks, and to strengthen the defense, the cybersecurity of the DIB and better safeguard DoD information inside their supply chain, they have developed the Cybersecurity Maturity Model Certification, CMMC. So over there on the right, you have a picture of down below the Apache helicopter, which is a US military helicopter, and above is the Chinese Z-10 helicopter. You can see that they look very, very familiar, and it's widely believed that the Chinese reverse engineered the Apache by stealing intellectual property. So this is exactly why CMMC was introduced. It's to prevent things like this from happening. And I think regardless of how you feel about CMMC, we can all agree that that's not an ideal situation where other nation states are able to close the technological gap on the United States by stealing that intellectual property. But it's more than just that. It's also about ensuring the availability of the supply chain. So if you have a small defense contractor who makes a very vital part and they get ransomware, not by a nation state threat actor, but just through regular cybercrime, and they're out of business and they're unable to make that part for 3 months, that could throw a wrench in the entire supply chain and slow down production. So they're also trying to prevent that. There are 3 levels of CMMC certification. We're going to go over them in the next slide. And as Chloe said, the rule, the 32 CFR rule, was dropped in October, and it takes effect next Monday, December 16th. So here are the 3 levels of CMMC certification. And the first one, level 1, it's only concerned with protecting federal contract information, or FCI. FCI is something that is not super sensitive, but the Department of Defense has warranted that it's still worthy of protection. So a good example would be a janitorial service company. They are not making things for the Department of Defense or the supply chain, but they have a contract with a military base to do janitorial services. They're not going to hold any intellectual property, but they are going to have federal contract information that they need to protect. And they're going to need to do a self-assessment every year to make sure that they have the minimum cybersecurity in place to protect that information. The difference between level 2 and level 3 is less about the information that's being protected and more about who you're protecting it from. So level 2 is for companies that are protecting less sensitive information, and as a result, they require less controls on that information. But if you're involved in a very sensitive weapons program, something that's cutting edge, you might be required to get level 3 certification because they want to protect it not only from the regular cyber criminal threats, but also from those nation states. Here's one slide. We could talk all day about the long and checkered history of CMMC, but I just wanted to break it down in one quick slide. It really started to get momentum in 2016 with the release of what was called the DFARS 712 memo. DFARS stands for Defense Acquisition. And what this did was, for the first time, it made contractors accountable for safeguarding the confidentiality and the integrity of defense-related data in their care. And they also had to provide adequate protection on that information by implementing the 110 controls in the NIST 800-171 framework. It also did things like mandate that contractors report cyber incidents within 72 hours. But really, it lacked any type of enforcement mechanism. There was no oversight, and that only started to come into play with the release of CMMC. There was an initial version 1.0, that got very close to being released in 2021. But the Biden administration kind of put the brakes on it and said, look, we don't think this is going to work. It's too complicated. It's got too many levels. We need to go back to the drawing board and do a rethink on this. So the Defense Department and the Cyber AB, who's the organization who's tasked with implementing this, they went back, they had to rethink. They came up with CMMC version 2, and here we are. We're a week away from CMMC being released. Now, before we dive any deeper into CMMC, it's probably useful just to go through a couple terms so we're all on the same page. Caution though, you are about to enter a TLA zone. The DoD loves 3-letter acronyms, and CMMC is chocked full of them. The first one is the Defense Industrial Base. Those are all of the people that provide everything from large, technologically sophisticated weapon systems, highly specialized operational components, to general commercial products and routine services. The best estimates I was able to find was that the Defense Industrial Base currently encompasses over 60,000 companies, over 1.1 million employees. DoD contract spending alone last year was $440 billion, and it represents 1.6% of American GDP. So it's huge, and we see this every day. And a lot of our channel partners here at Field Effect, managed service providers, have at least one DIB company that they provide IT services to. The other acronym, the other TLA on this slide is OSA. That's an organization seeking assessment. That is just the CMMC vernacular for when a DIB company decides we are going to go for CMMC certification at one of those 3 levels. You'll also hear it referred to as OSC, or Organization Seeking Certification. Really the same thing. All of those 3s are roughly synonymous. CUI. Now, some people pronounce this CUI. I'm a fan of CUI. Just, I won't use it during this presentation, but I'm not against pronouncing it CUI. CUI is Controlled Unclassified Information. Now, when I think about CUI, I think about the plans, the specifications for those weapon systems that have to flow through the supply chain in order to get them built. Just for your awareness, over on the right-hand side, that is just a generic schematic of a tank. It is not CUI, and putting CUI in a presentation that's going to go public and be shown in a webinar is fundamental error in CMMC implementation, so don't do that. And ESP, the final rule It gave a good definition of what an external service provider or ESP is. And it means the external people, technology, or facilities that an organization utilizes for the provision and management of IT or cybersecurity. So what does that mean? When I think ESP, the immediate thing that comes to mind is a managed service provider, an MSP. A lot of small and medium-sized DIB companies have MSPs, and they are their primary ESP for implementing their technical and cybersecurity. Field Effect, as a managed detection and response company, would also be considered an ESP in the CMMC lexicon. Field Effect's also considered a security protection asset. So stay with me here for a sec. Some SPAs are ESPs, some SPAs are just SPAs. The definition is an asset providing security functions or capabilities for the OSA, for the company's CMMC assessment scope. So that could be your MDR provider, your SIEM system, any security cameras you have, the badge reader, all of those are providing security for the assessment scope. And if there's a service component behind that SPA, it's also considered an ESP. But if it's just a standalone camera and there's no security system or security company that's monitoring it, it's probably just an SPA. SPD, the final rule also gave a good definition of this. It just means any data stored or processed by a security protection asset. So the final rule made it clear what it was, but it didn't limit the scope to it. They specifically listed out the configuration data required to operate a security protection asset, the log files generated or ingested by a security protection asset, data related to vulnerability of in-scope assets. So if you have a security protection asset that's looking at vulnerabilities for any of the computers in the assessment scope, that's SPA or SPD, and any passwords that are used to grant access to the in-scope systems. That's all security protection data. It's not the CUI that we're really trying to protect, but it is worthy of assessment and some level of protection as well. The last one, C3PAO. That's a CMMC third-party assessment organization. Basically, those are the private sector auditors that are going to come into your, if you need a third-party assessment, they're going to come in and evaluate how well you implemented those NIST 800-171 controls. They're not droids, but there's a good chance that at least once during this presentation, because I do it on a weekly basis at least once, I'm going to call it a C3PO. So now that we've gone through some of the jargon that backstops CMMC, let's go through the big changes in the final rule. And like many things in life, it is a good news, bad news type of scenario, but I'm a glass half full type of guy. So let's start with some good news. So the good news is that the rollout of CMMC is going to be phased out over 3 years. It starts next week. The first year, they want to concentrate on the level 1 self-assessments and the people who can do a level 2 self-assessment. And then slowly over the next 3 years, we're going to build to the point where in December 2027, all new DoD contracts are going to contain some level of CMMC certification that's required on signing date. So you can't say, I'll get it in the future. It needs to be in place when the contract is given out. So that's the good news, is that it's going to be slowly phased out. The bad news, it's not going to matter to a lot of defense industrial based companies, because you can see in that little snippet below, DoD has the authority to roll out CMMC requirements into contracts at any point in the next 3 years. And that leaves a lot of companies unsure about when their current contract or a new one that they're interested in acquiring is going to contain CMMC requirements. The other thing is that if a DIB company is a sub-supplier to a large prime contractor, that prime contractor could request almost immediately that either you have CMMC certification or that you're working towards it, and they'll want to see evidence of that. Here's some more good news. Level 1 and some level 2 certifications are going to closely resemble the status quo. So they're not going to require the C3PAO to come in and do that independent audit. It's going to be a self-assessment against either NIST 800-171 or the 15 controls of basic cybersecurity for level 1. You're going to upload that score into the supplier management system for DoD that's called SPURS, and that's it. So that's good news. But the bad news is that, as we explained before, level 1 certifications are only going to be available to people who are handling FCI. So it's not going to be applicable to anyone who has controlled unclassified information on their systems. And level 2 self-assessments are going to be rare. We don't know how rare. It's completely within the DoD's purview to assign a specific level of CMMC certification by contract. I can imagine that things that are less cutting edge, a mortar or artillery system that's been around since the 80s or 90s, would be level 2. And then the more cutting edge stuff would require either a level 2 independent assessment or a level 3. But that's just me talking. It's completely within DoD's responsibility to assign that. Good news. ESPs, oh, this is really good news. ESPs will not require an equivalent level of certification to the OSA. In the final rule, there were hundreds and hundreds of comments from external service providers saying that if you require every MSP who has a DIB company to get CMMC equivalency, the whole system's not going to work. It's never going to be able to be implemented. And they listened. They said, at least for now, at least for this initial version, ESPs will not require an equivalent certification. So that's good news. It was going to totally screw up all of the implementation, because no DIB company or small DIB company would be able to get certified before their MSP, before all their SBAs. It was going to be a nightmare. So I'm really happy about that. But the bad news is that ESPs will still be drawn into audits to show how they help the company meet those requirements. So we don't get off scot-free, but we don't have to go through a costly and full independent audit. And here's an example. There was a great example at the CyberAB's CMMC town hall last month about how an MSP could be drawn in to an audit. And they gave the example of a managed firewall. And what they said was, if an MSP is managing that firewall and the passwords for it are stored in a cloud-based password manager like 1Password, then it should be pretty simple. They're going to want to see that the password vault that those firewall passwords are in are limited, that only the people who need access have access, that the password manager is protected by multi-factor authentication, but it should be a fairly simple process. However, if the MSP states that those passwords for the firewall are stored on their local network, let's say in a password protected Excel file, then that could draw in a whole bunch more of the MSP's network into the audit. They might want to see the MSP's access control policy. They might want to see the security controls and logging on that computer where the password file. So the subtle implementation difference in how an MSP does it are going to have a huge impact on how much they're drawn into audits. It's something to think about. I put the QR code for the CMMC town halls down in the bottom right-hand corner. I've found them to be just an absolute fabulous resource not only to get in-depth information about the current status of CMMC, but to pick up these little tidbits about how it's actually going to be audited and what C3POs are going to be looking for. So I highly recommend you attend them live or watch the videos when they're posted a week after. Here's some good news. ESPs and SPAs that don't store, process, or transmit CUI in the cloud will not require FedRAMP moderate authorization. And I'm saying this not only as a security protection asset that doesn't have FedRAMP moderate certification. The fact of the matter is that a lot of defense industrial-based companies were going to be spending 2025 ripping out really good cybersecurity solutions simply because they didn't meet the FedRAMP moderate equivalency. And they were going to be pushed to a small number of EDR, MDR, SIEM providers that cost a lot of money and maybe don't even have the full functionality of their non-FedRAMP tools. So I think this is a really good decision. It's going to allow Field Effect to play a much bigger role in the cybersecurity of the DIB. And it's also just going to provide more choice to end customers while still showing that they meet the NIST 800-171 requirements. I put a note on the bottom of the screen. In the Cyber Town Hall last month, they were talking about backup solutions. And somebody asked a question, can I use non-FedRAMP backup for CUI if I don't have the decryption key? If the decryption key is only with the defense company? And their answer was no. If you store CUI in the cloud, even if it's encrypted, it's still CUI, and that backup solution would still need to be FedRAMP moderate. So more choice with security solutions, maybe still less choice with backup solutions. So that's something to be mindful of for the MSPs in our audience. Here's some more bad news. The choice that they have, it leaves organizations seeking assessment open to selecting, MSPs, SPAs that aren't really leaning in on CMMC, that don't understand the requirements and aren't well positioned to help them achieve their compliance goals. So it's just something to be mindful of. And that's one of the reasons why Field Effect wanted to get our customer responsibility matrix out into the public as soon as possible before the rules came into effect, because we really wanted to show that we were taking this seriously, that we feel like we have a role to play, and that we're willing to lean in and help our customers any way we can in achieving their CMMC compliance goals. That's available on our Trust Center, and there'll be a QR code for that at the end of the presentation. Good news. To achieve level 2 certification, an organization seeking assessment will only have to achieve a score of 80%. So the maximum score is 110. The minimum score is -203, if you can believe it. You only have to achieve 88 out of 110, or 80%. Yeah, there's significant bad news here, is that achieving a score of 110, it only buys you time. So if a C3PO comes in, they look at your controls, you either have an open plan of action and milestone, or they find a new one, that's only going to buy you 6 months. You have to fix that problem, resolve it, and then they're going to come back for what's called a closeout audit in 6 months. They don't do a full audit, but they're going to audit the specific controls that have an open plan of action and milestone to make sure that that's now satisfied. I realize I just threw in a new term there, plan of action and milestone, or POAM. All this is a detailed plan that's used to identify, assess, and manage the remediation of security weaknesses or deficiencies. In ISO 27001 land, we call them a corrective action plan. In CMMC, they're called a POAM. That's really all of it is. And DIB companies can find their own POAMs through their constant monitoring. They can uncover them themselves, or they can be uncovered by a third-party auditor during the audits. More bad news on this. CMMC has a really complex scoring system. So we talked about needing to achieve 88 out of 110. The obvious, there's 110 controls in NIST. The obvious assumption one would make is that each of those controls is 1 point, and that you have to satisfy 88 of the 110 controls to pass your audit. That's not true. They've broken down the scoring so that 44 controls actually have 5 points assigned to them. 14 controls of the NIST framework have 3 points, and 51 have 1 point assigned. So that's the, to the best of my understanding, that is the formula below to calculate your final score. And remember, folks, this is CMMC version 2.0. This is the one that was supposed to be less complicated. So you have to take the number of controls in each of those point brackets, which were not met, add them up, minus them from 110. That's your final score. To make it even worse, a whole bunch of the controls are not POAMable, if that can be considered a word. They're not eligible for POAMs. So what that means is you could have a near perfect audit. They find a single one of the controls that is not being implemented at all. And you could end up with a score of 108, 109, and still fail the complete audit, not be eligible for that closeout audit, have to go through a full audit again. And that could be for something as simple as control 310.4, which is about physical access logs. So you could have a near perfect audit, and then the C3PAO discovers that you're not keeping physical access logs for the work floor where CUI that's printed out is stored, and you might have to start from square one. So it's really important to understand POAMs. It's important to understand the scoring system, which of the controls you can have a finding on and which you can't, and really to make sure you have a solid implementation of NIST 800-171 before you go into that audit. This is good news. The final rule and the NIST framework itself, they both contain a lot of subjectivity. So I just highlighted that in the bottom. You might not be able to read it, but for security protection assets, all it says is assess level 2 security requirements that are relevant to the capabilities provided. So it does not say in grainy detail, if you have an MDR provider, these are the NIST 800-171 controls that they should be satisfying. This is how you audit them. It's a really loose statement, and that's a good thing because it should be about outcomes. It should be about making sure that CUI is safe, and this provides MSPs, MDR providers with the flexibility that they need to help that DIP company meet their security requirements without getting pedantic about it. But the bad news is the final rule contains a lot of subjectivity. Subjectivity can be good. It can also be bad. What that means is that every C3PAO is going to bring their unique brand, their unique knowledge, their history to the audit, and they're going to have the ability to be subjective about it. They might interpret the rules differently. They might interpret the NIST framework differently. And if I was a managed service provider with 18 companies that needed CMMC certification, my worst nightmare would be that they went out and they all selected different C3PAOs, and that I had to be drawn into audits with 18 different companies, 18 different assessment teams. I had to start from square one, explaining my company, how we do business, how we protect our customers. That would be my worst nightmare because of this subjectivity. Let's get into how to prepare for a CMMC audit. And the first thing, obviously, that you have to do is implement the security requirements, implement the 15 controls for level 1 or the 110 NIST controls for level 2. But before you can even do that, you need to understand your CUI flow or your FCI flow if you're level one. But let's talk about CUI. Your CUI flow in your organization. If you don't have a good understanding of where CUI enters your organization, everywhere it's stored, locally and in cloud providers, where it leaves the digital world, where it gets printed out, how it gets loaded into, let's say, the CNC milling machines that actually make the products sometimes. If you don't understand this, which employees have access to it, you're going to make your scope too big. And that's going to lead to increased time, effort, cost to implement the security standards. It's going to lead to increased auditing time. So the idea here is to really understand your CUI flow, make it the scope of your certification as small as possible, enclave off all the CUI stuff from your regular corporate stuff, and then make the scope of your certification just the CUI assets. This is the way that CMMC implementation can be done effectively. The next one to get prepared for an audit is to select the right C3PAO for you. Now, there's a limited number of third-party assessment organizations right now. I think the last number that was provided at the town hall was about 60 or 70. It's one of the biggest concerns people have about CMMC is that until the ecosystem gets built up, that there's going to be a lack of auditors, and this is going to drive the price for audits up. But you should still kick the tires, interview multiple C3PAOs, and find one that you feel like you can work with. Get multiple quotes, make sure that they're competitive, and really ask the tough questions. We already talked about how subjective some of the final rule was, and some of the NIST standard is also subjective. So get a thorough understanding of how they interpret that subjectivity and understand their auditing philosophy. The last thing that you want is to select a C3PAO that believes every SPUR score from a self-audit that was submitted was fraudulent, and 2025 is the time that we can drop the hammer on defense industrial-based companies for their sins of the past. That is not something that you're looking for. You want somebody who's willing to work with you, who understands and really is going to help you get to your CMMC requirements. So understand their auditing philosophy. The next one I would highly recommend to get ready for an audit is get a gap assessment. Some companies are also calling this a readiness assessment. But the general goal is the same. They're going to come in pre-audit. They're going to look at your control implementation, and they're going to tell you what gaps you have to fix prior to the full audit. If it was me, I would want the gap assessment or the readiness assessment done by the same C3PAO, preferably the same assessment team that's going to come in because of that subjectivity that we've been talking about. I don't want to go to somebody who says you're good to go and then have my assessment team come in and say, no, you got a problem here, here, and here. There's enough subjectivity that I would want that. The whole reason you're doing it is the same. And most compliance frameworks, I would recommend the same thing, that you get a gap assessment prior to game day, just to make sure everything is fine. The last thing I wanted to mention was that being audited, just like taking a test, is a skill in and of itself. And the way you get ready for an audit is to be thoroughly prepared. No time you spend preparing for it, you will consider wasted. Even if it turns out that you didn't need all that preparation, it's still better to be over prepared for an audit, because as we've already seen, the stakes are high here for CMMC, and even small implementation errors could lead to a failed assessment and having to start from square one. So what we do for our external audits is we create an internal playbook for every single control, and we have all of our weak spots, all of our strong points, what evidence we're going to use to show the auditor how we meet that control, where we want to steer them towards, maybe where we want to steer them to what. And it's so everyone has that game plan and we're all singing from the same song sheet. Another, be professional with your C3PAO, but keep your answers short. You don't want to start telling them the entire history of your audit, of your IT, and all the problems you have. Ask a question. When they ask a question, be direct, be thorough, but don't give them any information that they don't require for that answer. The last one was time management. I've never been a part of an external audit that ran according to the schedule that was initially set out by the auditor. I don't think I'll ever be part of a third-party audit that ran according to schedule. It's just one of those things. They always seem to run behind schedule. And that is not your concern. It is the job of the C3PAO to keep it on schedule, to make sure that it ends on time. And honestly, if your audit falls behind schedule, it's often good for the auditor or the auditee, because it just means that they have less time to kick the tires on some of the later controls in the audit. And that's not a terrible thing if you're trying to achieve a 110 score on your CMMC audit. The QR code down here is a short but very humorous video. It was designed for ISO 9001, which is a compliance framework for quality. But really, what they're talking about here and how to approach auditing, how to be professional in an audit, and how to be prepared are universal. We have all of our staff watch this video before they have to interact with an auditor. And I highly recommend that you watch it, use it internally as well. I found it a great resource. So the last part of our presentation is field effect and CMMC. I didn't do a lot of here. I figured that we'd almost be at time when I got to this section, but I just wanted to make a couple of quick points before we turn it over to you for any questions that you might have. Here's the QR code if you want to go check out our Trust Center and download our customer responsibility matrix for CMMC. As I was mentioning previously, it outlines all of our responsibilities and the responsibilities of the organization seeking assessment when using our MDR service. It provides information on how we're helping you satisfy the level 2 NIST 800-171 controls. But how is Field Effect here to help? Other than providing a great MDR service, if you want us to review your system security plan, we can do that. Obviously, we're going to be here to support you during audits if we get drawn into them, but we're always here for general questions and advice about CMMC. We're not selling compliance services. We're just here for our customers to help them any way that we can. So if you want to take advantage of that, I am always happy to chat CMMC. And it's one of those topics that we're all learning all the time. We're all learning on the job here. And so any advice or help we can be of, we're happy to do it.
We do have a few questions for you here, and this one includes a MAT term. Which source identifies which controls are programmable?
Oh, that's in the final rule. It's in the final rule, but to the best of my information, all of the 5-point controls and all of the 3-point controls, except for FIPS encryption and maybe MFA, are not programmable. And there's a bunch of level 1-point controls that are also not programmable. It's all in the final rule. And so what that ends up with is, I think, almost half, if not more than half, of the 110 NIST 800-171 controls are not programmable. So it's important to know which ones those are, because those are the ones you need to make sure that you're really locked down.
And I like that we're coming out of here with like a new term.
That's not a new term.
It's not?
No, that's not a new term. It's part of CMMC speak.
Programmable.
Programmable. I got poem.
Next up, if an MSP claims they can perform a CMMC readiness/gap analysis, how can a prospective client validate their capabilities?
Yeah, that's a good question. There's lots of people that can perform, gap assessments. MSPs could perform a gap assessment. Any registered practitioner or CMMC certified professional can perform a gap assessment. I would just ask them questions about the services they provide, what level of detail they go into on the controls. But the big thing with a gap assessment, especially if this is the first time you've gone through a third-party audit, is you want the gap assessment to look and feel as much like the real audit as possible. So you get a chance not only to see how your controls are implemented, but to go through an audit and to feel what they're like before game day.
How involved is the MSP in the audit process versus the DIB themselves?
I think it depends on the implementation there, right? It really depends on how deeply embedded the MSP is in the DIB company. But I think for a lot of MSPs, the answer is going to be a lot. I think that they're going to be there for a large percentage of the audit. And that's why the final rule made it clear that although external service providers, they don't require an equivalent level of certification, they can do that. They can go out and get CMMC level 2. So it's something that MSPs and MDR providers as well, that we might do in the future if we keep getting drawn into these audits and we find that it's taking a lot of time and effort and drawing us away from our normal jobs, then we'll probably just decide to go out and get it so we can hopefully, when one of our customers is being audited, just flash our CMMC creds and then move on.
Does this mean that Field Effect is going to pursue CMMC creds?
Yeah, I think we're going to see what it's like to get drawn into an audit. But yeah, I fully expect that we're going to go down that road. We don't want CMMC certification to be an inhibitor to our go-to-market strategy. We know that the defense industrial base is big, and we want to support the small and medium-sized businesses. So, and plus we're getting a SOC 2 audit. We have ISO 27001 implemented. NIST is not altogether that different from those standards. And the customer responsibility matrix that we provide makes it clear that with Field Effect MDR, none of the CUI leaves the auditing boundary. That we are not scooping up the tank plans from your computers and bringing them back to our data center. And we have the ability for our customers to log into the appliance, if they have one, and to verify that that's actually occurring. So we feel like the actual implementation of NIST 800-171 for us would be kind of trivial because we don't have CUI.
Matt, do you know the dates for not being able to win contracts if you do not have the CMMC certification?
They're going to be slowly. I think a year from now is when you're going to start seeing level 2 language in contracts. But remember, we stated that it's really under the DoD's purview. They could start implementing CMMC requirements in contracts starting next Monday.
There's just a quick response saying I heard it was April 1st, I'm assuming, 2025.
Oh, that could be it. Yeah, it could be it. But what I'm saying is it's going to be well before the actual full implementation date of December 2027, when you can expect to see that type of language in every contract.
Do we have a list of required non-poemable? If there's something we'd like to put together, we can include that in the email send out.
We could, but I would advise people to go back to the 32 CFR final rule. There's a whole section there on the point scoring system. And at the end, it makes it clear what an organization seeking assessment needs to do to meet that bar. And one of them is that they have the 80% score, but that no control other than FIPS encryption is POEM'd at the 5-point or the 3-point level. So if you find the controls that are 5 points and 3 points, that's it. That's a good start for the ones that can't be POEM'd. But remember, there's a bunch of 1-point controls as well.
Do you know when they will convert everything to Rev 3 that came out in May?
Oh yeah, that's a really good question because we mentioned NIST 800-171 a lot. And right now CMMC is tied to revision 2, even though there's a newer revision to NIST 800-171 out there, Rev 3. I believe they mentioned that at the town hall last week, and it won't be for at least 3 years, I think. I'm looking forward to it though, and I think everyone should be looking forward to the conversion to because I think NIST 800-171 revision 3 is just a much better document.
And I think that might be it for our session today, Matt. So thank you once again for walking us through all of that content. I hope that it was very, very helpful for everybody who is here today watching. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to letschat@fieldeffect.com. And other than that, look forward to seeing you in the next session.
Thanks, everybody. Hope you have a great day.